Hi, welcome to Write More Light. My name is Sarah with the Midwest Writing Center, and I am excited for today's interview with Alec Hershman, author of upcoming MWC Press Chapbook For a Second in the Dark. For folks who don't normally join us, Write More Light is a twice-weekly web series in which once a week we give a short writing lesson, and once a week we interview somebody very cool in the arts who I am lucky enough to curate these. But if anybody has suggestions, cool people we should talk to, do let us know in the comments. The layout of the show will go as such. We will interview Alec about this gorgeous book that I've now read, I think, 3 times. So I can say with absolute certainty, it's still good after 3 reads. After the interview, I'll give updates on the Midwest Writing Center, and then we will give a writing prompt. So thanks for joining us. Alec, thank you so much for being here. Let me read your bio before I forget. Meant to do that before I acknowledged you to your face. Alec Hershman is the author of 2 previous volumes of poetry, Permanent and Wonderful Storage from 7 Kitchens, and The Egg Goes Under, also from 7 Kitchens. He is a grassroots labor organizer and currently serves as a chair of education for is it Ypsilanti? I've never actually said that out loud.
Ypsilanti.
Ypsilanti. Oh, there's a T in there. Yep.
Yep.
Industrial Workers of the World. He lives with his husband and dogs in Michigan. Thanks for correcting my pronunciation, and thank you for hanging out with me today.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Also, thank you for submitting this book. We are, I know this gets a little confusing. I believe this is our 2021 selection, and it's being released in 2023. I know the dates get confusing. But I feel really, really lucky to be able to be part of publishing this book, putting it out in the world. And I want to, tell you that to your face and to the world. There's something.
Thanks for doing.
I end up saying this probably on every episode. I know that I have like all the enthusiasm in the world for this work, and it's because I have all the enthusiasm in the world for this work. But I'm worried that it just eventually sounds trite or corny. But I really, really mean it. So thank you. Let's just get into the meat and potatoes. How did this? Well, no, we're not going to get straight into it. I'm gonna go slowly, like a real interview. How did you start writing, and how did you start writing poetry?
Oh boy, how did I start writing? I started writing in my late teens when I was a college student, and back then I was a linguistics major, and I was really, fascinated with grammar and language and sound. Human speech sounds, but I didn't think of poetry, formally. But I had to take a class just to qualify for graduation with a bachelor's degree that was in the arts or humanities, and most of my focus was in social sciences. So I took this 8 weeks writing class on the poetry of Wallace Stevens, and that was really one of the first. I mean, I'd read poetry before that, but that was one of the first books of poems that I read kind of as such. It was the Library of America edition of the collected Stevens, and we read, all of it. And so that was one of my formative examples of what a book of poems might look like, or a lot of poems by the same mind. And I found it really profitable for analysis purposes to go through that book with a linguist's eye and look at grammatical techniques, and look at all of the transliteral wordplay that's happening. And that's around the time that I started feeling kind of like this extra energy that I didn't know what to do with, and that's when I started to kind of make my own poems. And I didn't, the first while that I was doing that, I wasn't really thinking of myself as a poet, or I was going to aim focally at doing poetry or making that. But that's kind of when I first started to think about the mechanics of poems and the making of poems and how are they put together. And that's when I started to sort of create my own. And then, I was kind of late in my undergraduate career. And so after I graduated, I was managing at a Starbucks in Indiana. And that's when I sort of was able to give more energy and attention to making poems, and that's when it started to become a more significant interest of mine. And so then I just kind of went back to the university where I had studied and found the poets on campus and bothered them and said, hey, I want to come just sit in on your classes, and sort of that was my earliest introduction to poetry. So from there, that was almost 20 years ago now. So from there, I've been just making them kind of steadily ever since.
That's two notes. I just you just reminded me I was going to audit a linguistics class this term at one of the local universities, so a little embarrassed about that. Gonna have to apologize to the professor. But a bit of synchronicity. I think the last three folks that we've had on the show have had some background in linguistics, which as a child I thought was like learning foreign languages. I don't know if that's like a common misconception or not, but that's what I thought as a kid.
Yeah.
Like
I always think this complex of feeling like an imposter, because I was so heavily into it and I loved linguistics, but I also, until recently, couldn't even speak any foreign non-English language with much proficiency. I speak some Japanese now in a way that I feel is conversational, but for most of my linguistics time, it was knowing lots of things about many different languages, but not in this way that I could use them. So yeah.
Well, I think that must be, and I mean, it's super interesting to me as someone who loves language, but I think that must be like a really useful, like holistic background to have as a writer, to really understand like the deeper pockets of language. And I guess you've said mechanics, so I wanted to say a different word, but mechanics is the right word, the mechanics of language.
It used to be for me. I mean, that's how I started, and I really thought, in a very sort of, and I still do sometimes, but I like this rational approach to making poems, which I had I entered poetry kind of naively and maybe slightly later than a lot of my
We should
colleagues.
all enter poetry naively.
Well, that's true, right? So I did it, and I did it, I guess, a little bit later than other people who maybe knew they wanted to be like English majors in college and loved literature from a very early age. But I used to think about things much more formally. I guess that's how I entered. Was really not that I adhered to or was in love with very strict traditional formal stuff, but everything had that's how I apprehended poems that I encountered first, was through their form, and that's also how I tried to think about my own. But in the many years that I've been making them now, I've become much more relaxed and sort of in touch with mystery, and so I don't, those dimensions exist, of course, in the poems still, and on some level they must still be informing my writing, but I don't think about I don't think about the syntax and the form quite as self-consciously anymore. I think that has really started to maybe develop some habits and styles of its own that now just exist independent of me having to like decide about them or think about them quite as self-consciously as I used
Oh, that's I can't I can't speak to to your experience, but I think that has to be why our education is predicated on learning basics first, right? So that we just internalize them. But yeah, I was thinking, I don't know if you saw, because I am not looking at the camera when I'm not looking at the camera. But I was trying to see if there's anything in here where I would say, oh yes, this is clearly X form. And I write all over these when I'm first engaging. Well, anytime I'm engaging with a book. And normally I would be like, oh yes, clearly a sestina or something. And I definitely didn't write like recognize this form anywhere in here.
never written a sestina that I've been happy
It was
with.
a really weird choice. It wasn't even the word I thought was going to come out.
Now, because 14 lines is a much sort of briefer bar to hit, it's hard not to get sidetracked by that sonnet possibility. That kind of like whirlpool just sort of sucks in certain amounts of poetic lyric verve, and then so I have things that for for one reason or another, kind of get close to sonneting, and then they're in dialogue with, with sonnet tradition. So I think a lot of contemporary writers end up there, and I think that in part has to do just with the brevity of the form, and the relative permissiveness of the form. Sestine is a more exotic kind of thing, to accidentally
Yeah.
do, and I just have never connected with that one.
I know that some people are really into the constraints of form because of how they, I assume, challenge them.
Yeah.
I say I assume, and I know people have, overtly said that, but I just can't. You give me a box and I feel like I'm in a cage. So
Sure. Yeah.
it's not something I fully comprehend personally. But yeah, I don't get that vibe from your work either. But let's talk about it. How did For a Second in the Dark come to be as a collection first?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I wish I had a more satisfying answer to this question, but I kind of expected you might ask that. And the truth is that these are all just poems that kind of felt like they had, like I'd learned something when I made them, or I liked just kind of how they landed, or they felt sturdy or complete in their own right, and they all came from like a similar time period, and so they had those kind of environmental conditions in common, but thematically I am a little uncertain, a little stumped, and it's not like I couldn't try and make some story about the through lines between these pieces, but it wasn't a self-conscious um, organization as much as some of like my other chapbooks were, or some other projects that I've attempted with organizing poems. And I have a weird kind of, I mentioned that my poem making practice has basically just been continuous for like 19 years now. And as a result, I have more material than I'm able to think about curating or publishing or sharing. And so at first, when I first started like trying to publish poems around maybe 2010, there were just like, a couple hundred that could even maybe go out into the world. And that the rate of publishing and sharing poetry has just been at this kind of like steady little trickle. And meanwhile, I keep making new stuff. And so uh, there's this way in which that allows me a certain distance. So I feel very cold-eyed when I came back to these are poems that were written around like 2011, 12, 13 maybe. So I'm speaking to you here in 2023, and so they're about a decade apart from my work now, and so that made it easier one day to go back and just sort of pick some. So I just kind of, there was a little bit of a top-down formal idea that I was just like, there's enough material here that maybe it'll speak to itself as a kind of chapbook. And so I just kind of intuitively selected, and then on a very different occasion, came back to that pile and sort of culled it and weeded it and made an organization. And this is something that I have the energy to do every once in a while, maybe once a year. I kind of have a spare afternoon and can have the attention for that. And then I kind of see where is there an opportunity to send them at any given time, and I sometimes I get these lucky connections, and so that's kind of how this chapbook came to be. And then Ryan had some ordering suggestions for me that I think I took almost all of them, and thought, yeah, and that kind of opened up the sequencing in a way that was really helpful to me, actually, because that's one of the things I struggle with the most in organizing poems. Is I have this large number to select from, and then within those selections, the possible permutations really kind of overwhelm me. And I am the kind of writer who both really likes bottom up mystery and surprise stuff, but also, if it's going to be a book, I really feel that there should be some non-arbitrary reason that we go from page 8 to page 9. And so, so on some level, I think I had to tell myself at least a story about every junction between every poem, that there was some latch or some strand of connection, even if it wasn't this proximal connection from one page immediately to the next, but that the order, had some rhyme or reason to it. And so once I felt that there was like enough of those connections in the pile of poems that I had gathered, then that's when I, kind of felt like, okay, I could try calling this a book and give it a title and see. But that's the general process.
Yeah, I've often thought about talking with someone about because I just haven't yet had to do this myself, about ordering a collection.
Hmm.
Because and it's complicated because I feel like everybody has a different set of reasons about how they would do what they do. Um, and a lot of the times, working with young people, especially, we talk about like music, right? An album
Yeah,
can be a
sure.
collection of singles, or it can be one
Right.
narrative. It's always going to be one narrative, but the way you order it changes
Hmm.
that. And then of course you go from there to playlists, which is user curated. Um, and you don't see
Hmm.
it. I mean, you do, right? That analogy would be the anthology by someone else. Uh, um, but I feel like when we don't use that analogy, we get very like only writers are interested in hearing this, um, which
Sure.
I don't mind talking to writers all day, but it's a useful analogy. But
Hmm.
everybody has their own logic behind how they order their own.
Yeah.
And I mean, you said Ryan helped a bit with the structure, which I didn't remember till you said. And I was looking at the table of contents and I was thinking this seems different. So glad to
Mhm.
know. I
Yeah.
am paying attention. um, but there's also something to that distance, which one, I don't even like to look at work of mine that's 10 years old. So bless you for that. Um, but also that distance can add insight, the distance of this isn't my work, so I can see where it might have a better conversation with itself or the audience. But also the
Yeah.
distance of these poems are old enough that I know what they're saying now. I don't know if you
Yeah.
get that, but I know
I
maybe I didn't quite see what I was saying when I was saying
I
it.
do. Yes. So much of for me, so much of poetry and making poems is still intuitive. So, it's this interesting exercise because you've got your rational mind on too. I do, tinker and edit and lineate, but even though these are kind of formal measurements, they they're still just happening intuitively. And so yeah, sometimes it takes years for me to realize or think I have a handle on why something. So I feel a strong sense of I know if something is interesting or not interesting, or has that liveliness to it, or doesn't, but I don't always know why. And sometimes, yeah, sometimes it takes years. Um,
Um, Shoot, you said something I wanted to respond to, and I didn't write it down.
It'll
Oh,
come.
yeah. I mean, this isn't it. This is just the next question, but um, now I was gonna look and try to quote you directly, but I'm having trouble with that. Where were you mentally when 10 years ago when these poems were coming about, if you don't mind sharing?
Sure. Yeah. Hmm. Well, not in like the the happiest place, but also in some ways in a very good place artistically. So in the early 2000 teens, I was in my 20s, early mid 20s, and kind of recently graduated from an MFA program and was really struggling with the question of whether or not poetry was a professional thing to do. Was this a was it a career? There's this kind of big, at times intrusive or distracting thing that we see as artists, where some people appear to have careers, some of them quite nice, comfortable seeming careers that make their art focal and make that their work. And that's a perpetual fantasy. for me, I suspect for a lot of artists, but it's also a practical reality that, the more artists I meet, the more writers I've met, the more, I've come to understand that is, you know, not the normal state or the expectable or typical state for people who are inclined to make these kinds of products, whether it's poetry or other writing or other art or music. Musicians could probably sympathize with this too. And so there's this way in which I had just come out of, this environment where a lot of people were aiming at this kind of version of being an artist, a career, especially within academia. So, going on to pursue more degrees or finding academic appointments and jobs. And I taught higher ed, poetry, composition writing, literature courses, and also some other things for about 11 years. I only recently stopped doing that. But I did it as an adjunct instructor. So I was kind of had like still one foot in that game. And it's an exhausting way to be a worker and to be an artist. And so these poems kind of came out of a period where I had a certain chip on my shoulders artistically, which was, you know, on the one hand, I wanted still to sort of prove that I could make worthy things that, could, in theory, like qualify me to have uh, academic appointments or opportunities that people who do that sort of thing have. On the other hand, I also was really becoming disillusioned with that system. Was really seeing some of the toxicity effects on my friends, my colleagues, mentors, and starting to kind of deeply question whether or not this was a path that would lead to a a healthy life, for myself or for my art. And so I felt very protective of my time and my artistic impulses too. And so I kind of went into hermit mode for about this is sort of like the end of about a decade of hermitish exile that I imposed upon myself after kind of doing the arts MFA thing, really um, earnestly, and then came out of it and thought I just came away with so much discomfort about the intersection between these two things, the sort of career work thing and this like artistic, muse thing. And so these are some of the poems that I was making, and not really. I mean, I did publish some of them in magazines, but basically these were all just written, alone and by myself, sort of for myself, and and I didn't really take a break until a couple years back to ask, could these live together? Is there a book? I very much bracketed kind of that's about the sort of professional development level where I stopped, was like, oh, is it time to have a debut book? And there's something, that I still feel to this day is so linear and arbitrary and a little bit constraining about a book, sometimes in a good way, like a sonnet or, any formal apparatus, but also, just like you said, you feel like you're in a cage when you're doing a form piece. Like there is a part of my poetic fibers that just balk at the idea of this linear ordering. On the other hand, it's so good and tempting, isn't it? Like when you read a book and you're like, oh wow, that's a whole movement. There's like this cohesive reason that these poems come together in a section, or you see why a book has a certain architecture. And once you see that, then it's hard not to want anything, like that for your own work. So that's kind of this kind of aggravating standard to which I want to hold my work. And so it just meant that I postponed these questions of organizing poems forever, almost interminably. I would sometimes do writing residencies during this period of in my 20s, and my application pitch was always the same thing of like, oh, I have these poems, they have these themes. I just need, a few weeks to sit down and make a book. And then I would invariably go to these lovely places, and I would maybe I would try for like half a day. Maybe I'd do the thing where I'd spread them out once or twice and like look, and then I would only want to make new poems. Like, so there was something kind of generative and propulsive about avoiding the organization of a book that helped me make about 1,000 poems that are finished now.
I also feel like when you do finally get that space or whatever, like how are you gonna just not create?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like
I'm very attached to the creative part. Like that's
I
the fun.
right. I don't know how to say this, and it's like no matter what, I'm wrong. But like I feel like the boring part should be when you're bored.
Mhm.
We should be
Okay.
creating when we're in a creative space.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a way in which I have some friends who are writers too, and sometimes they speak to me about writer's block, which I think is some part of, but I can't really make sense of what that means outside of the context of this expectation that you should be creating, which is this very, but I think then we're back to the sort of career idea, or this idea that
Mhm.
somehow like we're the hat of poet in the world or something, you have now this like industrial expectation that is placed upon you. And I think one of the positive things about the choices I've made as an artist to say, to really eschew that piece, have been that I don't really feel bored or uninspired to make stuff hardly ever. I mean, I'm busy at the moment in my life, but I seldom go more than a week or so without making some poetry. And it doesn't mean, it's always like a finished poem kind of thing, but I write pretty much weekly, or a few times a week. So yeah. Yeah, you're right. I
Yes.
mean, I think that's more organic, and that's my impulse too, is to sort of go with the bottom up feeling of it.
I just, I think that, and you've spoken to this quite a bit, but I think that people get so preoccupied by audience or success or whatever the material object of or that symbolizes that is. Even like
Mhm,
we talk about writer's block with our interns. They're in their teens usually, and not usually,
mhm.
always. And how it's something that we hear about and we talk about a lot, but like to properly have writer's block, you need to, like, in the vernacular, what we mean is I'm having trouble writing. Um,
Mhm,
but there's a few things that could lead to that. One is like you lack inspiration, you're blocked up. The
mhm.
physical act is difficult, right? And but all of it, I think, ends up being expectation. And that's where we forget to be artists, right?
Mhm.
So I guess it's heartening to me that you take these opportunities, which ostensibly are for doing one specific task, and instead you are generating. That's really heartening to me that that artists are being artists rather than product makers.
Yeah. Let me kind of touch on that, and I guess my politics of poetry is such that I don't actually understand or see a reason that as poets we should ever have writer's block in that way, because poetry to me, I don't understand what it would mean to have poetry that was supposed to happen. I know there are poets who would disagree with me, and for them they have some sort of a bigger container, like a project in mind. I can understand what it might be like to have writer's block if I was writing a nonfiction book, or I had a paper to construct. But for me, that's just not, those just don't tend to be the kinds of poems that I care about making. Or I don't recognize the ones, as I read them. Maybe I don't recognize it if that's how those were constructed, the ones that I like. So I just don't know what that would mean. Like, if there's not a poem, there wasn't supposed to be a poem. It's kind of how I think about it. So I guess I should put an asterisk on writer's block and say that I think I completely understand it for prose length projects that can't be done in one episode of making. But for poems, and there are longer poems too, so I suppose it might have obtained for like epic length poems. But for shorter lyric poems, I just don't understand like what that would mean.
I I love hearing this. I've heard similar from Ryan, our director. And that just
Hmm.
it's a pleasure to hear. The thing I wanted to respond to earlier, you said that there was something intuitive about structuring work or writing the poem the way it comes out. And this isn't really so much a question as something I think about a lot when I talk to non-artists, particularly non-writers, but non-artists. I feel like all artists are, and I'm never trying to be specific to only speaking about writing when I talk about art. But non-artists who I have issues saying that as well, because we're all artists. We're all in the act of creation by existing, who like don't believe that these things just happen when you create. Because I said something along the lines of like, I didn't control something in a piece that I was working on. And the person I was talking to was like, but you wrote it, right? And I was like, that's not, but that isn't,
Right.
but I'm just holding a pen. And yeah, I feel like too, I mostly only interact with artists. And so I'm wondering if you've seen that as well when you talk about your work. Are people like, how do you mean it's intuitive?
Well, intuitive, I think, for a while I kind of had this flirtation with the concept of surrealism, which is, I enjoy in many different artistic ways. And I thought it kind of applied to my own writing in terms of the use of dream imagery, or the use of kind of surprising associative movement, both in the terms of image, but also in terms of syntax, or in terms of grammatical things that happen. And I think now a better term for what I mean might be improvisation. And so, I very much don't know how a sentence is going to end until I'm already, halfway through it. And that's part of the pleasure of making poems. But that's not necessarily the unit that everyone thinks in or composes in. So I know there are writers poets who would think this is the next sentence. I might lineate that sentence, but they feel like they know what that sentence is. Sometimes I can get there, but to compose that sentence, I'm aware of it before I've hit a certain completeness. So there's some sort of intermediate syntactical unit that I often navigate by. And so intuition for me is like knowing that this prepositional phrase is how the sentence might begin, but I don't know what it really attaches to yet. And that's kind of exciting, to be able to start with these weird subordinate pieces of sentences and work your way backwards. Or so those are the kinds of step by step processes that I'm involved in when I'm making them. In general, kind of what we've been speaking about here is what I've come to think of as like this continuum of top down and bottom up compositional processes. And for me, one of the qualifying features of poetry is that it has to have at least some element of that organic, surprised, bottom up, something just happened, right? Something that you did not control. Some of the most formal poems might control a lot of it, but the point of it still being a poem is that it has this weird unit of measure. There's a line, or there's something that's not just, it's meant to be looked at, not looked through. And then there's this piece about it's got some organicity to it. Something is happening that we're channeling, or that we don't completely control, or that we're not aware of before it happens. I think that's the filter that we're really talking about when we talk about like conscious decision making or something like that. So bottom up is, I feel like I've gotten more in that direction as an artist. The more I do it, the more I feel like it's a capacity of allowing things to happen, right? So letting, or channeling, or watching, or sensing,
Leaving space for surprise.
Yeah, giving that space for surprise. But I think one of the interesting things, you asked about other people who are non-artists and how they deal with poetry. It occurred to me recently that poetry is this really interesting, beguiling thing that gets us into a strange kind of political territory, because we're a really motley group of people who make poems. And it's because of this, because we fool ourselves, because poems are in language, and they are one of the very few things that we do with language that is not communication. It might be I mean, it might have pieces of
It can
communication.
communicate, but it is not an act of communication. I get you.
but you mentioned audience, and sometimes, poems are things that can be written in this almost channeled like way that you don't have audience design in mind. And that's some of how I make some of my poems. And I suspect that's true for most poets. But then one of the weird, strange things about making a poem is that you've put something, you've made utterances in language, and there they are. And so they still have this sort of potential energy about them that's like, oh, are they going to be utterances? Can they go out to an audience? And so, I know that it's kind of cliche at this point to say, like, it's not coded speech. That's what we tell non-artists. We say, oh, it's not just like, you're not frustrated because there's really a message, and I've just obfuscated my message and I'm being uncooperative as a speaker. But on some level, there's a little bit of that, right? It's almost like we have this ambivalence of like, is this a message? Is this not a message? That's how I feel about my poems anyway. So like, I might make something this year and I don't, you know, care if there's an audience. I don't think about the audience. And then I'll come back to it in a couple years and I'll think, oh, this is kind of an interesting artifact. And if I just tweak it this way and that way, then it could be a poem message that goes out to poetry readers or even non-poetry readers. So I bring that up as a way of saying, for the people who out there who are maybe not artists, not poets, yeah, it's both, right? This is a message that has been forked and twisted and obfuscated in some ways, and also it's not. It's this thing that humans can do with language, but it's not the normal thing that we do with language in all the other domains, and that's really what makes poetry special.
Thank you so much for that and for your patience with me.
Oh
Um,
yeah, yeah.
I love the way that you pivoted a little bit from intuition to improvisation, which I think was fun. Is fun because they're related but definitely different. Especially when the person with whom you're improvising is yourself or no one or words. Because words are not words are an object, I guess. They're so much closer. Intuition and improvisation are so much closer than I would have ever thought if you hadn't used them, I don't know, almost interchangeably there. So it was really cool. I think about non-artists a lot partially because I don't believe that they exist. But the nature of my work with connecting art to whoever needs it or interacts with it. Of course, we all watch TV, we all listen to music, we all take pictures, whatever it is. So we all consume art. But folks who are not used to making it, I guess, see it as a mystery. And that interests me. But it didn't have to didn't have to interact with you, but I'm grateful that you gave me your perspective on it. So when you left academia, which I guess I'm assuming that is a time of your life that is currently on pause.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so this is like two parts because I wanted to get us back there. You were in a space of protecting your art time, your art space, your art brain, while you were in academia, and you made a decision to leave. Is that related? Are those two bits related? They don't have to be.
Yeah, they are related. They are. My decision to leave COVID came. I finished the semester teaching online. It really subtracted out yet one more of the elements of classroom experience that I value. Actually, it subtracted out the whole classroom experience, just about. So I said, to the chair of the department where I was teaching, I'm on pause. I've only ever been contingent faculty anyway, and so I just, that was the first break I'd ever taken from that kind of work since I started doing it. And I realized how expensive it is. Adjunct instructors who now comprise like something close to 70% of all the instructional faculty, if you go across all the colleges and universities in the country are paid a nominal fee of like a few $1,000s to teach a class for a semester. And needless to say, it's not a good labor situation, but also it was I did all these other part-time jobs while I would be teaching. So I would work in coffee shops or restaurants or libraries or things like this, to make ends meet. And the pay started to, cross. And I realized, like, wow, even though I loved teaching, and even though, in some ways that was more interesting and challenging work, it was also more stressful. And I almost started to become suspicious that this was a way of uh, capturing and rechanneling a lot of important dissident energy that many of us may have as free-minded people or educators or artists. And so for me, that was just a personal choice to say, well, let me see. My personal situation at home changed a bit, and my husband has a professional job that allowed me some flexibility to try not doing that kind of work. And in fact, I mean, I've replaced my adjunct teaching with desk work at the local library, and financially, I have to squint to see the difference. Um, Stress wise, it's totally different. So that's it was just a rational choice as much as anything. But uh, relating to like the art, it's I feel protective for my own art, but also for like art with a capital A, poetry with a capital P. I've just been able to see now, across a couple decades, a certain degree of what I think of as like capture of higher ed in general. But it's really especially demoralizing to me to see some of the effects of that in things like poetry, because to my mind, like, if we're artists or we're poets or something, we're sort of inherently politically disruptive, um, and we should be, I think, especially democratic, especially egalitarian. And unfortunately, in the zeitgeist right now, I think is that, even though many of us individually feel that way, the systems that seem to be available to us to do art in this kind of sustained way, in art communities, tends to be competitive. There's just this real or imagined scarcity, and we're all asked to kind of constantly think about that, and but also to aim our artistic energies towards funding, towards prizes, towards this type of thing, tenure track jobs. And so yeah, so I think just kind of really, it's been a slow divorcing process, but really pulling some of the last tendrils of that out of my uh care have made it so that, like, there's no reason for me to make any kind of poem just because I think that that's what would be successful or popular in the poetry world. In fact, I really, deeply believe that if I'm going to make anything useful, it has to be, on some level, free of, or as free as it can be, of some of these distractions or control mechanisms that want to steer it. And so I've been, I'm a stubborn person, and I've been a skeptic and somewhat of a difficult student, uh, and I don't have to be one anymore. And I think that has been so freeing, to just have no master over me or my art. And that's kind of always how I've wanted to be. And I know, in respect, that that's different for other artists. There are some people who really thrive on having a community of people who will sort of check them, in some ways, or hold them accountable in some ways. I hear that kind of rhetoric sometimes about certain art fora and communities. And I've there have been times I wished I could be one of those people that would work for me, but that is just not my jam. So yeah, I've kind of hit my speed, and it's pretty independent,
I'm really
better or worse.
grateful to hear, well, all of this. Uh, um, I remember, being in school and people would be like, oh, what are you going to do with your English degree? Work at the coffee shop? And
Mhm.
I felt that it was, very derisive and rude, but like factually, the least stressed I've ever been is when I've been a barista. And that when you're less stressed, you're able to make more art. So I don't know if um those people are right that like it's not the only job out there for students of English. Um, it's not. But
Yeah.
I think that looking into being open to or knowing ourselves, right? And knowing that we're doing our best work when we have the capacity to make work, the
Mhm.
capacity of time, space, energy, whatever it is. Um,
Yeah.
I definitely, I'm always sort of happy to hear when folks are making coffee or working circulation at the library. I guess you said the
Yeah.
desk,
Yeah.
because it is just healthier. Are we doing our best work when we're not able to make anything? Probably not.
Yeah, I don't know. I ask that question often, and I think about sometimes a little bit wistfully, and sometimes otherwise. Like, oh, what would have been if I had blazed an easier path into an academic job or something like that. Um, and I sort of come to the conclusion over and over that it's just different. So I'm sometimes tempted to think for myself the same thing. That healthier is in many ways better and kinder for the art. It's certainly better and kinder for us, which is worth it. But I don't know. I just don't know. I was making things of a different quality or a different impulse when I felt more of that stress
I love the word
and
impulse there.
impulse. Yeah,
Beautiful.
because some of my work is an impulse, and it comes out of these seemingly irreconcilable tensions that I'm feeling.
Well, I felt
You know,
like impulse, like frequency too. It's just
uh huh.
beautiful word use.
I mean, I think that's what it feels like. In fact, if there was a kind of poem that I think belongs in this book, I was anticipating your question about like, well, why is this even a book? I think there's something.
I did not say why is this a book.
Well, I mean, but that's a good question,
I
and
know.
I know you said it more eloquently than that,
How
but
dare
that's
you put
that's
this
the
in front of me?
should always ask. We should always ask, like, why is this a book? I mean, I ask that about poetry books all the time, and a lot of my favorite ones are ones where I kind of find an answer. But I think that the first poem and several of the other ones are these kind of like neurotic dispatches that I remember were born of a particular kind of, I don't want to say like a crisis moment, but there was like a surge moment, an impulse where everything precipitated, and it was just because I had been thinking about some kind of an interpersonal political tension. And when I say political, by the way, I'm not thinking of like electoral politics or things like that, but just like the what is power doing? Um, how where's power in our interpersonal lives and our interactions with people, and so that's what comes down to sort of animate some kind of a scenario. And so there's a bunch of these kind of like allegorical scenario poems, and they all kind of share that neurotic manic energy, which despite everything I said earlier really is born from a kind of stress, um, or is a way of metabolizing a kind of stress. Not to completely contradict everything that I said
No, that's so
earlier.
good. And I mean, maybe that's the struggle of language, right? Is that so many words have so many meanings. Um, my sister is a visual artist, and I am a word artist.
Mhm.
And we lived together for a while, and we would make art together,
Oh,
meaning in the same room at the same time, not collaborate, not a proper collaboration. Um,
gotcha.
and I always got this feeling like her work was somehow much more personal than mine was. And she said to me, it might be, I mean, it might not be, but it might be.
Hmm.
But the issue with language is that it's more specific, and people can say, well, you said this, and these words mean these things. And so it feels like there are fewer interpretations to make, and that's why people might think that you're giving more information through writing. I don't remember what made me say that, but it's something I think about sometime, about like the specificity of language, even when it's not that specific.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I'm just wondering though, like, isn't the color very specific too? Or, if you're making something sculptural and it has, this 38-degree angle, like that's very specific. I'm not sure.
The thinking, as I understand it, is that people believe that they understand word choice better than they understand
I see.
something
Right.
a little
It's
less tangible.
that presumptuous audience again, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I see. Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think we're often mistaken, in thinking that words are as nailed down as they are. We have dictionaries that do capture something empirical about how people use words, but words are kind of like vectors too, and they're always moving a little bit. And then you have to think about them also as like probabilistic tokens over, millions of times that we say them, and then billions of times that they're said in the community around us. And they're kind of like in this cloud, and that cloud is always got some different edges, right? So there's yes, we have. You're right. I think imagine is the right way to think of it. There, we imagine that the words mean very specific things, but words are zones.
I love linguists.
Well, I can't claim to be one anymore, but
Well, the thinking about it though, I feel like a lot of people don't, this disaster behind me. There's a 7-foot case.
Mystery is over here, and we're not gonna know what it is, but it might be crucial to the poem.
Shoot, language is a living thing. It evolves and changes every day with every use, which is what you were saying.
Yeah.
But there's still people, and I'm occasionally the people, but there's still people who are like, no, it means this because that's what it said in this dictionary that I, read this one time.
Right. Yeah.
But it doesn't like that. At least not outside of France.
Language is also our bodies, I think. Like I think it's and sometimes people are right when they point to the dictionary and say this is what this means, and also, not. That's an interesting scenario that you're talking about, where people say, like this is the sort of thing that happens invariably in a poetry workshop, right? Where people are discussing the meaning of a poem, or trying to, especially under the assumption that maybe the ultimate form of the poem is still flexible or could be changed, and it's just interesting to hear these kind of meta linguistic statements that people will make about why, in principle, X should mean what you think it does, or a different word is more suitable here. And on some level, we need that if we're going to do editing and remodeling of the poems. On the another level, at the same time, that is political, and it's about power, and we're constantly having this negotiation over our craft and our poems. But that's also a proxy for our bodies, and so that's why I think it's so fascinating, but for me anyway, kind of sensitive and visceral, and yeah, I don't know. There's something that I've really, part of that protective impulse I have about my own poems is this idea of making my own decisions about my own body, or my own sense of propriety. That's not that I'm sort of choosing not to scaffold or lean on a group's idea about, how my words should mean or do mean.
So what does your, oh gosh, was absolutely not paying attention to the time. Do you have a couple more minutes?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm in
So
no
what does
rush.
your editorial process look like then?
Well, it's not too elaborate. I will say that. I So because I started to think about some of the themes that we've been discussing here, about the sort of like top down versus bottom up impulse for making the poems, I got to a point, these poems are very much from that point where I thought most of the poem comes from the impulse. And so 90% is sort of hammered out right away in this episode. There's an episode of making, I might change some stuff after the fact, but most of it is as it occurred to me. And I tend to, favor exploration and quantity gathering over, you know, getting a few lines and really chiseling at them forever, or until they're just what I want. So my editing process basically is first conjure, and then in a different mindset, sort of sobering up from the conjuring episode, I'll come back the next morning, the next day, or the next year, the next decade even, and I just kind of recut the lines. And then I that gives me access to kind of like I'm kind of like osculating the poem to hear where things flow or don't flow, and based on that, I tend to work from smaller sound units back up to the whole poem until I have a relatively smooth contour that is also just intuitively appealing to me. So that's kind of the editing process. Most of the language comes in the first draft, and then the sound gets adjusted and smoothed in the second draft. And sometimes, as just a consequence of adjusting sound, I will swap out a word for like its monosyllabic synonym or something like that. So sometimes there's like diction editing that happens, but it's not usually because I mean something specific and I'm trying to get my meaning to the reader more clearly. It's because the music is got like this sort of iambic rush to it, and this word is too, clumsy or whatever, it's too long or something like that. So that's the gist of the editing process. And then I don't know, it's like there's like 90% first draft, then there's like 9% in this kind of like smoothing process, and then there's like this like 1% that's like the final editing might be, oh, this poem could basically live with these other poems if this line weren't here, or if this word turned into that word so that it could be in a latch relationship with this other poem. So there's like this last little 1% that poems sometimes incur if they go into a book.
That's so interesting. I don't work that way at all. I'm really grateful for that. I'm glad I asked that. I also am so excited anytime, and it's poets, right? It's never prose writers, or very, very rarely. And I pay attention to that as somebody who works in hybrid primarily.
Oh, okay.
It's always the poets who are interested in sound, which is so
Mhm.
interesting to me because most of language is spoken, just period.
Yeah. Right.
Language is an oral communication form first and most often. So it's interesting to me that some people aren't listening
Mhm.
for sound. So I'm glad that you
Yeah.
did bring that up as an important part of your process.
And visual too. So I love,
Yes.
once typing or even just writing, I mean, transposition of letters, it's a huge thing that I love playing with.
Oh, sorry.
Did they get it? The cat? Did they get what they were seeking?
It's laundry.
Oh, cool.
I have a cat who delivers laundry to me. It's very sweet, but it does not belong in the office.
But perhaps expensive. I don't know.
It's great. It's always clean laundry. Usually it's less to carry for me. Okay, last question, and then I'll ask you to read to us, because I think this is an okay segue. Can you tell me about the title, For a Second in the Dark?
Sure. Well, that's a good question. It also came kind of intuitively after the poems had been gathered. It is a piece of a line from a poem called "The Elevator" that's in the book, and
Yeah, I wrote titular moment next to that one.
yep, yeah, titular moment, right? So this is not.
That's an inside joke in my house. My
Oh, okay.
house will always yell titular moment anytime that occurs in any media. So now I
I
have
like it.
to.
I haven't had that handle before, but I will take that up and look for some titular moments as I go about my day. Yeah, I mean, that's all it is. It's nothing. This is nothing particularly new or innovative. This is just like a technique that I've seen many contemporary poets use, and I
Oh,
like
really
it.
good title.
And yeah, the title is like just putting a little pressure on this one moment in this one poem to kind of give some kind of a figurative, handle on the book as a whole. It's a chapbook, so the half line for a second in the dark comes from and refers to like a, I guess for lack of a better word, a scene in an elevator. And so I just think about, this is like a small space. Um, y'all have been really great at humoring me and making
I
this
love this
awesome
cover so much.
of like, which was just like, I don't know, I'm not a graphic designer or artist, visual artist at all, so I just thought, maybe it would be really cool to have like an elevator on the cover of the book. So that's what we're looking at here, is like this interior elevator scene.
And it's got this like great balance of like creepy and sterile.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah, we
really
looked at a bunch of them, and Skylar sent me a lot of possibilities, and had, was
she's
much more
really
like
good at her job.
minutia than I could be about this, but I think it looks really cool. And so like that's the title. I guess I also mean for it to gesture towards um, a state of ignorance and maybe danger that a lot of the poems emanate from. So a lot of times there's a speaker who's misseeing something, or is slightly wrong, or slightly, if worried about or afraid of in some uh benighted way what's going on around them. And so that's kind of what I mean, is like, yeah, for a second in the dark. And then, it's just these little, it's sort of a lot of what the poems try to do is to sort of zoom into these smaller moments where things are dark or confusing. Um, Maybe especially as regards our relationship to other people who are standing too close to us in these confined spaces. Um, I hadn't quite ever unpacked it psychologically like that before, but I think that now that I'm saying it out loud, I think that's all accurate.
I mean, it's all there's textual evidence for it.
Yes, there's
Um,
textual evidence.
I mean, that's why there are plenty of book titles that I wouldn't say, tell me about the title, right?
Okay.
Including in our chapbook series. The book Choir is by Aubrey Ryan, who will be one of your openers on Friday.
Okay.
Is from the point of view of the choir as in like a Greek play. And it's cool. It's like feminist reimaginings of classic Greek stories. It's excellent, but the title's pretty clear. And the title's pretty clear. Or like our anthology, These Interesting Times, is an anthology of 2020. We just heard that,
Sure,
over and over and over again.
right.
But
No, I
this,
like a little bit. A little bit. I mean, that's just an ingredient I work with a lot, so it makes sense to put it in my titles.
yeah, no, I think it's a title worth looking at. So would you mind reading something to us?
Sure.
You
Do you have any requests? I mean, I could read the title or the poem from which the title
yeah, let's do that. And this will be our teaser for Friday, which everyone should be at Roz Talks at 6 p.m. We're gonna have a short open mic. Then we're gonna have our featured readers, which include Aubrey Ryan, Emily Kingery, and Sophia Best, all of whom have some really gorgeous chapbooks out, all of whom have won some really cool awards for their work. And of course, the release party for a Second in the Dark by Alec Hershman.
Cool. Well, okay, so we picked a strange one.
You read any of them, it doesn't.
It's got the titular moment in it, so I guess.
It doesn't. I'm not married to your choice. We can go anywhere.
Well, we'll take a ride in the elevator, since it's the titular moment. It's on the cover of the book. So the elevator. As surely as the blazers lit by coffee came, the workday ended. Doors revolved with leaving clap, like synchronized doves, and the charm of interns seemed long ago in an alcove and shelved. Good night, collared nerves and pleasures, unbettable desks shoved from. Whatever forgotten or undone must stay, a shut mistake for now. And the whisper of the tissue paper fan began, let's all of us get in the elevator together. There was the warp and low light of the brass, where, formal-bodied, we stowed ourselves, modest emissaries of our heart's content. We became increased by sympathy as the floors flew up, each a cake in the hazard of the gap. It terrified my inner miser to slit my pocket bottoms as suddenly I wanted to, yet still I drew some comfort in the gloves the operator wore, little zigzags in the stitches holding them together, whereas other moments held hands, as only strangers could, for a second in the dark, and tender by mistake, and thank God for that cage that kept us from the shack.
Tender by mistake. Thank you. I've been spent a lot of today trying not to cheer out loud. Which is cool. I like having I like being excited by what I'm interacting with. Have I left anything out that you want to share? I have plenty more questions that I'll have to shelve for another time. But I want to make sure that you can say anything you might want to share with our audience.
Just thank you for inviting me to do this, and thanks to MWC for publishing my little book. And yeah, I'm excited to see everyone on Friday.
So excited. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with us. I'm going to move on to MWC updates, and then I will give a writing prompt, and we will be off. So of course, I've just said Friday at Roz Talks. That's at 2108 3rd Avenue in Rock Island. You should know that by now. You're watching this video. It's my favorite place to have our events. It's our most common venue. Not favorite, maybe it's rude to say favorite, but it is. That's doors are at 6. And we'll have those featured readers at 8, I think. Tomorrow, Wednesday, we are continuing a little pilot program for Wednesday night free writes for young writers. That's middle school and high school age. We're going to share space with other writers. We've got Wi-Fi, we've got printers, whatever kind of community you need to be in with other writers. We're open for that purpose. That is from 4 to 6 Wednesdays in October for young writers. Thursday, we're celebrating Banned Books Week with the Rock Island Public Library. The event starts at 5:30 with a reception. The event is at the Rock Island Public Library Watts Midtown branch at their auditorium. We've got 15 readers. So we're going to be looking at a lot of really wonderful banned books. We'll talk about why the books were banned. We'll talk about what makes these books special. We'll get little itty bitty excerpts because we cannot read 15 whole books in one evening. Those sets will be short. We will not take up more than 2 hours of your night when you join us. Then Saturday, as with every first and third Saturday of the month, is Writer's Studio. We're currently doing both in person and online. Those are 2 separate events. The online one is via Zoom. The in-person one is in our offices in Rock Island. Again, first and third Saturday of every month, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Writer's Studio. That is a open-hearted, community-minded workshop group for writers looking for critique and community. The group I run is the online one. We're always looking to make your work what you want it to be, not what our taste would otherwise dictate. Again, next Wednesday, we'll be doing another Wednesday night free write for young writers. And then, oh my goodness, where is it? Oh, it's because I'm 2 weeks away. We'll be at the Iowa City Book Festival in Iowa City at the book fair on Saturday the 14th. And then next Thursday, so Thursday after next, actually, October 19th, again at our Spectra reading series, again at Talks. We will be hosting Erica Lewis on her Mahogany tour. So please come hang out with us whenever you can. We will be here. For folks waiting for that free write, please set your timer to 5 minutes and give yourself a moment of using that sentence that we have now officially appropriated from Alec with "for a second in the dark." Have that be your prompt. Thank you for joining us, and please write more light into your life.